so excited to get to teach this series. Someone said, Mark, you're wearing a fancy suit today. I said, yeah, I'm talking about the law. I thought I'd wear my lawsuit. Dun-dun-dun. Lawsuit. Clearly, the masks that you're wearing is inhibiting the sound of your laughter. I'm absolutely thrilled to be teaching this series, and I've got about 173, I think, people that I email the lesson out to, thank you, Brent, that I email the lesson out to ahead of time to get their thoughts, feedback, and things like that. And when I sent the email out this week to people, I said, I recognize I may have geeked out a little bit too much in the lesson this week because I just went full-bore lawyer on some of this stuff. And I just got to tell you, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. Speaking of geeking out, okay, Brent, let's do this. Let's just refeed it and see if that drives it. Okay, now it shows it's picking something up and driving. Oh, but it doesn't look like it's picking that up and driving. Are you driving? Nope. Okay, would you figure that out while I just entertain them with a little song and dance? Here's a number I learned in vaudeville. No, I'm joking. So the idea of this series is one that I'm kind of stoked about. But what really invigorates me is it seems that most of the people who speak about the Bible are theologians or they're Bible experts. And so when you read things about the law in the Bible, you're reading things generally through the lenses of people, scholars, who are biblically trained. That's their specialty. That's their niche. Some of the people I sent this lesson out to are Assyriologists who specialize in ancient Assyria, who can read cuneiform as well as you and I can read English. And so and those are people who've written on some of the material in today's lesson. But my joy in this, and what's got me really geeking out, is I'll read it through the lens of someone who spends time in biblical studies. I'm not a credentialed biblical scholar. You know, my degrees ended with an undergraduate degree in Hebrew and Greek. But I'll also read them through the lens of a legal scholar. Because while I've been teaching the Word for the last 40 years, I've been either in law school or being a lawyer for almost 40 years now. I started law school in 1981. And so I want to approach this, and Brent, you need settings? I need to approach this from settings for anything in particular, or those settings? I need to approach this as a lawyer as well as a biblical scholar. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to geek out. Here's the problem with the lesson today. My chances of making you grasp the significance of what I want to teach are about 100 times better if we have a video capability. Maybe higher than 100 times better. So while Brent continues to work, the one thing he failed to pray over in that opening prayer was our video. So let's just have a word of prayer. God, I pray that this lesson will be taught today with power, with illumination, with insight that flow from you and your Spirit, and that the electronics will do what electronics should do, and that I will do what I should do, and that our ears will be what they should be, and our eyes and our hearts and our minds, so that we can better behold your glory, better worship you, better become like you, better seek your face and better shine your light in the darkness around us. We humbly pray through Jesus, your word. Amen. Okay, so with that, what are you looking for?
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, we have to undo it, and then we're going to redo it.
Okay, so I'm going to go upstairs, and we're going to switch it through the op switcher, so they'll do it upstairs.
Okay.
So just bring your PowerPoint up online.
Okay, bring my PowerPoint up online. Y'all don't panic. Don't leave. Look, I'm watching. I'm watching. Anybody leaving? I'm watching you. I saw you heading for the door. Going, gone. Presenter view. Boom. Okay. We don't have anything there yet. But y'all hoop and holler if something happens on that screen. Meanwhile, I'm just going to tell you the things I was going to tell you, and we'll see how good I can do with words, okay? Hoop and holler, Brent to the rescue. Thank you, Lord. Not Lord Brent, Lord. Brent, pastor. Okay, so here's the problem or the predicament we're in. How many of y'all are living in the 21st century? Okay, most of you. That's good. That's to check to see if you're still tuned into the lesson. So in the 21st century, we live in the century of science. And science has made remarkable advances. Did you know it was in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, that Jules Verne published this bizarro book, absolutely bizarro, entitled From Earth to the Moon. And the idea was that after the Civil War was over, some folks made a big cannon almost, a big gun, a big rifle. And inside the bullet, they put 3, what we would call astronauts, and shot them to the moon, literally. Shot them to the moon. It was a rifle, a big rifle. And it was like 15, 20 years later that someone called that bullet-shaped object a spaceship for the first time. But we've lived to see that become reality. Popular Science had a great article where they talked about 7 things that used to be science fiction that have become reality. Defibrillators in 1820 were written of as science fiction, but in 1947, the first one was made and used to jolt someone's heart back into rhythm. Not just defibrillators, the space stations, the whole idea of a space station, 1869. By 1971, we've got the beginnings of one. Whoops. Number 4, lab-grown meat. Who really cares? Number 3, computers. Computers, artificial intelligence, 1872. But by the 1950s, you've got a computer beating MIT people in checkers. Long-term heat storage. That's just called Houston. Who cares? Number 7, portable audio. 1953, Ray Bradbury writes about it with a little transistor. 1954, TI makes their first product. I skipped number 6, tasers. 1911. 1974, they come into being. We still there? Brent, the master. Here's the problem. Because we live in a scientific age and we've seen these massive scientific advancements and we look at yesteryear as just, so backwards. We'll have that same tendency to think about things like law in the same way. But we should not. Law has been around, and law has been very substantial longer than there has been writing. They have found ways that contracts were made, agreements were made, before there was even an ability to write them down. And what they would do is they would make an agreement based upon the color of a rock or something. And then they would encase that rock in clay in such a way that you had to break it open to see what the deal was. Once you finally get into the earliest written laws, it's apparent from reading those laws that the legal system had been in place for a long time. I mean, our law system today deals with family law, marriage, divorce, remarriage, custody. Deals with tort law, what happens if you run the red light and hit somebody. Deals with criminal law. You rob a store, you get caught, you go to jail. Deals with immigration law. Deals with contracts. Deals with all sorts of things. Those laws have been in place as long as society has been in place. Different laws, different degrees of complexity. But if we put up a map of the relevant ancient Near East, and I say relevant because I mean relevant to this lesson. Ancient Near East, I put into quotation marks because this is a buzzword phrase. This phrase, ancient Near East, that's what scholars use to talk about a region. They define it a little different, but it's roughly from Turkey down to Egypt. Some will go over to Libya as well, over into what's now Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. And that region today is called the ancient Near East. Now, in the ancient times, Turkey was called Anatolia. You've got the Hittites there. You've got this Mesopotamian region. You've got the land of Canaan, which Israel comes to occupy. And you've got Egypt, Mitzrayim in Hebrew. And so that was the land that produced our first written laws. So if we want to go and look at what ancient law looked like, we're studying the ancient Near East. And what I would like to ask you this morning is to focus on one question, which was the focus of this lesson when I wrote it. It'll be the focus of this chapter in the book, God willing. And that is this: what, if anything, was unique about biblical law, the law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai? Was there anything unique about it? Anything that made it stand out from all the other laws around it? So to walk through this with you, I have done this in 3 steps. Step number 1 is I want to define the approach. In other words, it's one thing to ask a question and answer a question, but let's be real clear. Let's say, okay, here's how we're going to go about answering the question. We're going to set up the boundaries of what we're looking at. If you want to make sure you've got a good, valid conclusion, you try to set out what you're going to do before you draw the conclusions. Otherwise, you have what in science is known as post hoc analysis, which is like really ruddy. Okay? That's the difference between saying, I'm going to flip a coin, and I'm going to count how many times it's heads and how many times it's tails, and I'm going to decide what the odds are of it being heads or tails. If you do that, set it out ahead of time, I'm going to flip it 100 times, and I'm going to make the decision. I'm going to make the analysis and draw conclusions. That's what you would do. You don't say, well, I'm going to flip a coin, or you just flip a coin and it turns out heads. And then you say, okay, I'm going to write it up. Every time you flip a coin, it turns up heads. Well, you only did that once and you figured out what you're doing afterwards. It just doesn't work. You got to first set up your approach. Make sense? First thing we got to do is decide how we're going to look at this so that we're fair about it. Then the second thing we're going to do is we want to compare and contrast those other legal systems, legal codes, to the one given to Moses at Sinai. And then the third thing that we'll do is we'll gather the implications from that. What does that mean? How does that matter to us? Who cares? Type stuff, okay? So that's our goal. We're going to start by defining the approach. The approach is pretty easy to me. The approach is, let's take the ancient relevant Near East and let's look at the code that was given on Mount Sinai and compare it both in time and location to other legal codes. So let's look at the laws that come from the same general area of the world. That's why I haven't included the laws of Manu from India. Let's look at the laws from the same general area, and let's look at them both before Sinai and after Sinai, so that we've got a good sense of what the other law is around Israel, and we can then compare and contrast Israel and get some conclusions we can draw. Okay? So that's what's set out before. So we're going to look at legal codes from down near Ur. We're going to look at legal codes from up near Eshnunna, from the whole area of that region. You'll see about that, the laws of Lipit Ishtar. We're going to look at Middle Assyrian laws, and that is our approach. You got it? Okay, if that's our approach, let's now compare and contrast, and we're going to need a timeline to do this to make sure this makes sense to us time-wise. Now, different people date the Exodus and Mount Sinai differently. Some people date it early, in the 1400s BC. Some people date it later, in the 1200 BCs. Those scholars are the ones who date it under different readings of the Bible, but they accept the biblical text. And so if we look at those scholars who accept the biblical text, that is the time range for the Exodus. I'm one, and if you go back to our classes we've taught here, I explain why. I'm one of the 1200s type people. I put it under Ramesses II. But that's when Moses would have gotten the law at Sinai. So we'll use that time range for our study of other ancient laws. We're going to go back to the earliest written code that archaeologists have yet to uncover. It dates from around 2100 BC. These are the laws of Ur-Nammu. Ur is a city and a region, actually, at the time. And Nammu is the king of Ur. Ur-Nammu is the law code. If you want to see this law code, it's in Germany. No, actually, this is in Istanbul. You can go to Istanbul at one of the archaeological museums and see it. But to help put this into context, Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. Abraham dates from about 100, again, scholars aren't sure exactly, but probably about 100 years after this. Abraham comes from Ur, where Nammu was king. This could have been the legal code for Abraham as he grew up and came into manhood. So this is, archaeologists have uncovered, this is Ur-Nammu, who's appearing before the sun god Shamash. And so this is our fella. He's about 100 years pre-Abraham. By the way, Ur-Nammu is the king who built the great ziggurat of Ur. Just, you know, if you ever have that on quiz night, you'll know. So let me give you an idea of what the law of Ur-Nammu does. The law of Ur-Nammu covers a whole lot of the laws that we cover today in law school. It's not quite as thorough as Tech Law School was, but it's pretty good. And so under Ur-Nammu, you've got the law, if a man commits a murder, that man shall be executed. Under the laws of Ur-Nammu, if a man commits a robbery, he'll be executed. If you committed a robbery and then killed a fella, you might get executed twice. I'm not sure, it wasn't in the law. If a young man's wife, by her own wish, goes after another man, and he lies with her, the other man, they commit adultery, then the woman gets executed. Man gets set free. Sorry, Miss Caroline. She's like, huh, indignant. That was the law. Okay, let me give you another legal code. 1930. Now we're really honing in on the time of Abraham. 1930, you've got the law of Lipit Ishtar. Now, the law of Lipit Ishtar is the law that governed that area of Ur. Just a little bit broader region. But look at this provision. If a man takes a wife and she bears him a child, and that child is still alive, and a slave woman also bears children to her master, then the father shall grant freedom to the slave woman and her children. The slave's children shall not divide the inheritance with their ex-master's children. That's the law of the land where Moses and Sarah, Abraham and Sarah are from. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, whoa, wait a minute. I remember a story in Genesis 16 and Genesis 21. Here's the story. Abraham and Sarah are not able to have children. So Sarah says to Abraham, I'm going to give you my slave to be your mistress. And you're to have your offspring through my slave woman. And so Abraham goes into Hagar, the slave woman, and the offspring is Ishmael. Now, a couple of chapters intervene in the story, but Sarah ultimately is able to conceive. And Ishmael's now a young teenager, but Sarah's produced Isaac. And now all of a sudden, you are under the laws that Sarah and Abraham grew up with, exactly in the middle of this scenario. A man, Abraham, took a wife, Sarah. Sarah's now bore him a child. That child is still alive, Isaac. But meanwhile, a slave woman, Hagar, has also borne a child to him, Ishmael. So the father is to grant freedom to the slave woman and her children. He's to grant freedom to Hagar and Ishmael. And the slave's children aren't supposed to get the inheritance of daddy. That's the law that Sarah invokes on Abraham and tells Abraham to dump Hagar and Ishmael. And Abraham is troubled because that's his son. And God says to Abraham in Genesis 21, he says, Abe, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. He is your son, and a great nation will come forth from him. Just do what Sarah said. I got this. You don't have to worry about your inheritance. I'm the Lord, I'll provide. And so the offspring of Abraham, Ishmael, and Hagar are sent out with some water and bread. It runs out, but God steps in and provides. And Ishmael grows up to produce great offspring and a nation. Sarah, we read the story in the Bible and we think, man, tough people. Actually, in that culture and in that day, that's exactly what the law told them they were supposed to do. Let me give you another legal code. This one arises in the 1800s to 1700s BC. These are the laws of Eshnunna. Whoops, I went backwards. The laws of Eshnunna. Now, the laws of Eshnunna are really interesting. Here's one. A core of grain went for 1 shekel of silver. The law actually set out the price for goods. A core of grain is about 75 or 80 gallons. So you get 75 or 80 gallons for 1 shekel. A shekel of silver in weight is about the same as a $50. If you could get a silver $50 still in America, It'd be about the same weight in silver. So a core of grain goes for a shekel of silver. By the way, you could instead take that shekel of silver and get the equivalent of an Uber for 3 days in that society. It's a third of a shekel of silver a day to rent a pair of oxen with a wagon and a driver. And they have to work for you all day long. If you continue to work through the law, another thing I found interesting is sesame oil was 3 times more expensive than lard. Who'd have thunk? How about this? A man who is seized in the field of a commoner. In other words, somebody has trespassed and is in someone else's backyard. Among the sheaves, the crops, in broad daylight, has to pay 10 shekels of silver as a trespassing fine. But if he's seized in the night among the sheaves, kill him. I was talking to Steve Morris, about this week. And he laughed and he said, the moral to that story is in the middle of the day, you could say, gee, I hit my baseball into your yard and I'm looking for it. But nobody played baseball at night back then. But that's pretty clever. Clever way to look at it. I mean, if you're going into the middle of someone's yard in the middle of the night, you're up to no good. Kill them. But if you just go during the day, okay, you may have had an excuse to be there. That was the law. Let me give you another law from about the same time. This is one you've heard of, the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi dates from around 1800 to 1700 BC. And in that date, I've got the wrong stuff there. Here we go. Code of Hammurabi. Under the Code of Hammurabi, and you can see that in the Louvre. If you ever go to the Louvre, there are like 5 things you have to see. You got to see the Mona Lisa. You got to see the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, it's number 2 for me. Crimes and punishments are set out. Just typical crimes and punishments. But look at this law. This is family law, in the family law section. In family law matters, if a woman is betrothed to a man, that means they did not do engagements the way we do. That's where Charles Cross was in here. I saw him a minute ago. Charles, what's the son you've got closest to my Sarah's age? Thomas. How old are you, Thomas? Say it again. Loud. 14. Okay. I have a daughter, Sarah. She's 23. No, she's 21. She's a little old for you right now. But your dad and I are cutting a deal. And the deal is, if you missed it on video, Charles got up and started coming to me with a handshake. The deal is this. I'm going to give my daughter to be married to you when you get old enough. And there'll be a dowry exchanged. And in essence, we'll call that in legal terms betrothed. Technically, you're sort of married, but the marriage isn't consummated until everybody gets to be of age. Okay? So that's the process. So, if in family law, if I've taken one of my daughters and betrothed her to a fella, and the fella is verbally abusive to her, then and not that you would ever be, Tim, we've clearly left the realm of you in this consideration. My daughter has the right to flee the marriage as long as it's not been consummated. And even the dowry gets returned. It's the law of Hammurabi. Moral to that story is, have that betrothal long enough to figure out if the fellow's verbally abusive before you consummate the marriage. Once you consummate the marriage, hey, you made your choice. That's the way the law was set up. Now, we want to look at laws after Sinai too, because I'm going to tell you something about Sinai that is so compellingly different that it should inform everything we do in our life. I mean, huge difference. But to make sure that I'm being fair, I want to look at laws afterwards. So I'm going to look at the Middle Assyrian laws. Middle Assyria was Assyria during that time period between 1100 and 1000 BC. And we've got a lot of their laws on a lot of tablets that have been uncovered. But what I'd like to do is compare them in some ways to the biblical law, because I'm going to contrast them as well. Here's the biblical law out of Deuteronomy 25:5. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies, and the one who dies doesn't have a son, the wife of the dead man is not to be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. So here's what that means. Brent, I don't know if I've got the ability to write on this and change the screen or if you have to. You said, I think you're going to, oh, you are so good. Or whoever is doing this. So here's the situation you've got. You've got brother A, and you've got brother B. Now, brother A is married and has a wife. This is an interracial marriage. He was red and she was orange. Nothing wrong with that in the Bible. Brother A is married, and he's got a wife. We should put a skirt on her. Here. There. Now, they're married, but brother A dies. By the way, brother A's brother, in Latin terminology, is a levier. That's the Latin word for a husband's brother, your brother-in-law. And I tell you that because this is called a levirate or levirate marriage. It comes from the Latin word for levier, for a brother-in-law. Anyway, the brother is then supposed to take the wife as his own. She doesn't marry outside the family. You got it? Okay, go back to the PowerPoint, please, Brent. So, here's what we've got. That's the biblical law. Let me give you the Middle Assyrian law. It's got levirate marriage laws that marry up to the biblical law. Goes into more detail than the biblical law, but it's got brother B being engaged when brother A, or married but not consummated, when brother A's wife dies, and brother A's wife goes home to her mama and daddy, but she still is to be given in marriage to brother B. And if that doesn't work out, there are all of these details of how to sort through the dowry, etc. But it's very much on point and very similar to the concepts that are set out at Sinai. Those are concepts in that culture and in that day. Now, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to say, was there anything unique about biblical law? Let's go to step 3 and let's look at the implications, because there is something dramatically different between every legal code of antiquity that I can read that's even remotely in the time or location. I didn't cherry pick these. I didn't say, hey, which ones will make my point? This isn't post hoc analysis. I set this out ahead of time. Ur-Nammu is the oldest legal code you've got in the ancient Near East. There's not any fuss about that. I read the whole thing that we've got. We've got a good bit of it. Lipit Ishtar, the Middle Assyrian Laws, Hammurabi, Eshnunna, those are it. You can find some treaties and things that have legal implications, but those are the legal codes we've got that surround Sinai in time and location. And Sinai is dramatically different in very important ways. First of all, in Sinai, God gives the law. Eshnunna, the gods endow the king with authority, but the king sets up the law. One of the folks who reads my lessons sent me an email and said, all right, you've got these questions. You need to address this. You need to be more direct. One of the questions was, since those other legal codes had the gods who gave the king the authority, isn't it like the gods gave the legal codes? No. Those gods honestly didn't give that much of a care about what people did. They were too busy with their own intrigues and their own fights. They weren't seeking a relationship with humanity except for what humanity needed to do for them, sacrifice at times and things like that. But those people in the other legal codes, the king would get authority from the god to be king. But that's the limit of it. The gods didn't have anything to do with those laws. The king figures out what the laws should be. The laws are named after the king. And that's the way it goes. But that's not the case with Moses. God gave the law. God, take that off. God not only gave the law, but the whole law's about God. God calls them out of Israel or out of Egypt, calls the Israelites out of Egypt. God says, first thing you're going to do is come to Sinai. I'm going to bring you to Sinai. When you get to Sinai, Moses, come up on the mountain. But even before you come up on the mountain, I want all of Israel to understand I'm about to speak. This is my law. These are my commandments. This isn't the law of Hammurabi. This isn't the laws of Eshnunna. This isn't the laws of anybody. No Ur-Nammu. These are my laws. These are the laws of God. And so God gives the law to Israel and says, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy. Be law abiders. Be set apart. Be different than everybody else because I'm different. This law is me, and you're to be like me. I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. And you're therefore to be holy because I'm holy. You're to follow the law because the law is an expression of how I would live in this culture, in this time. It's an expression of God's morality into that culture and into that day. Now, it's very important we remember into that culture and into that day. And Jesus explains why. And we'll get to that later. And if you're saying, but I want to know now, tough. Keep coming back. But if you look at the way God gave the law, if we can go to the IPVO for just a moment. Israel goes to Mount Sinai. And look at this. This is dramatic. God says, if you will indeed obey my voice, if you will keep my covenant, if you'll do these things, You're going to be my treasured possession among all the peoples, because the whole earth is mine. But out of the whole earth being mine, you're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You're going to be different than all the others. And you're going to be the one who's my priest, who lets the others see and understand who I am. God says, these are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses comes, he calls all the elders of the people, and he sets before them everything God said. And the people all said, hey, everything God said, we're going to do. We're in. That's us. We want to be his priests. We understand he has the whole world, but we want to be his holy nation, his nation set apart. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord as if God couldn't have heard them. And the Lord, just remember, Moses is not always, you don't think Moses is perfect. It's like, God, let me tell you what the people said. God's kind of like, okay, Moses, tell me, what did they say? And the Lord said to Moses, listen, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud. I want the people to hear when I speak with you. They need to know this is the voice of God. This is the law of God. They need to know that this is what God has said. They need to know that so that they can believe it forever. And so it happens. On the morning of the third day, thunder and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and a loud trumpet blast. Everybody in camp is scared to death. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain is wrapped in smoke because God's descended on it in a fire. It looked like the smoke of a kiln. The whole mountain's shaking. And the sound of the trumpet grows louder and louder, and God speaks, and God answers in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. The Lord called Moses up to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. There should be no doubt about what is about to be said. It's not Moses. This is God's law. And here's what God does. He speaks out all these words. God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then the 10 commandments. Bam, 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 bam. All the way down. And then he starts talking about laws about altars. And then he starts talking about laws about slaves or servants. It's kind of dark there, sorry. He starts talking about laws about restitution and paying someone back when you've messed them up or hurt them. He starts talking about social justice. All of these laws he's talking about, these are the laws of God. This is God's ethic and God's behavior. If we go back to the PowerPoint, none of these other legal codes are the voice of God. None of them are God saying, here's what God expects of you. These are all, I'm your king. And oh, by the way, God gave me authority to be king, or the gods did, so you better listen to me and not rebel. That's why that stuff's in there. But here as king is what I'm telling you. Here's what you can charge for your Ubers. Here's how your marriage is supposed to work out. Here's crime and punishment. That is drastically different than God who says, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you're going to be holy because I, your Lord God, am holy. And so you consecrate yourselves. You be holy because I am the Lord your God. You be holy for I'm the Lord and I'm holy. I've separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. You get it over and over and over. Speak to the people of Israel. And say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you'll proclaim as holy convocations. They're my appointed feast. All of this is God. God tells Moses to build the ark and says, you build it exactly the way I tell you to. Don't you deviate a bit. This is mine. That just didn't exist anywhere else outside of Israel. That just was not typical. You didn't have anywhere where God said, where the laws say, you shall remember and do all of my commandments and be holy to your God. It just didn't exist. So what does that mean for you and me? So what? Well, it means a lot. On a fundamental level, let's go back to the basics. Greg, you emailed me about these basics. You're dead right. Let's go back to the basics. Basic. God made you and I in His, you and me. Sorry, I ain't got no good English. God made you and me to be in His image. That does not mean God has fingers and toes and a nose. But among what it means is you and I share His moral makeup. What's right and good and holy is what is right and good and holy for us. We share in God's morality, in His ethics. We're made in His image because we're called to be in a relationship with Him. And uniquely able are we to relate to God because we are made in His image. And intrinsic to that, built into that, part of that, woven into that, is a recognition that to be in a relationship with the holy God, we need to be holy. What, to put it into New Testament language of John, what commonness, koinonia, what does darkness share with light? None. By definition, darkness is not its own force. Darkness is the absence of light. Even a black hole is the absence, we call it a black hole because the light can't escape the intense gravitational pull. So you've got visually, we've got an area where we see no light emanating. Light and darkness can't coexist. We are to be holy like a holy God, to be in a relationship with Him. We can't be in a relationship with the Holy One if we're not holy. Now, our holiness doesn't come through the law. The law shows us we're not holy by how we live. Our holiness comes through the Holy One, Jesus, whose holiness is credited to us by the grace of God, by the cross of Christ, credited to us through our faith, our trust in it. So we look at these laws because they help us understand who God is. So I hope you'll come back next week. And I want to leave you with this psalm. The psalmist said, "As for me, I shall behold your face," talking about God's, "in righteousness." When we see the law and we see righteousness and we see purity, we are beholding the face of God. Now, my plan next week is to talk about the different kinds of laws that God gave Israel and how they reflect who He is. So we'll start that next week. Some of them make a lot of sense. Tell the truth. Don't bear false witness. We don't lie because God's not a liar. God's true. But some of them you might be saying, I don't get that one. We'll talk about whether or not you can have a ham sandwich for lunch next week. Got it? All right, let me bless us out of here and let's go to church. Father, thank you so much for the chance to teach this morning. Thank you for the electronics and so many wonderful people, Pastor Brent and others who work so hard to make that work. Thank you for everyone who watches on the internet and everyone who comes and attends and supports us here live. It is just our prayer, Father, very simple. May we behold your face. May we see a reflection of your beauty, of your love, of your mercy, of your tenderness, but also, Lord, of your holiness, of your awesomeness. Thank you, Lord, in Jesus. Amen. See you guys next Sunday, God willing.